DRS is something that a lot of people would label as a necessary evil in this modern world of Formula 1 that is equal parts sport and show. Who am I kidding? It's mostly show these days, isn't it, with shows like Drive to Survive helping to bring people in, but at the same time it gives them a false illusion as to what the sport is actually like. And DRS had its beginnings in the 2010 season, but it wasn't called DRS at the time. It was called the F Duct, something dreamed up by McLaren in a bid to create more speed in a straight line that cleverly worked around the wording of the rulebook, with regards to movable aerodynamic devices, that is. Because nothing on the car moved, it was deemed totally legal, and the other teams started working on ways of trying to copy it with varying results, as only McLaren had it built into the car by design. The way it worked was some black magic trickery. At least I'm going to describe it as that because I know the sum of sod all about aerodynamics. The way it worked is that with the system inactive, the airflow through the car was normal. At least normal in the F1 sense, and air passed through the car out the back and the car's aero did as was designed. With the system active, and it was activated by Jensen and Lewis covering a small hole with their knee, although later on in the season it was moved so they could use their elbows, the air through the car was rerouted so that it stalled the rear wing of the car and allowed for a little bit more of a straight line boost. Nothing on the car moved. There were no buttons to press, no electrical, hydraulic or other mechanical gizmos on the car. Because it was simply redirecting the airflow through the car and it was Jensen and Lewis doing it rather than some sort of computer, the FIA said the system was fine and was exempt from any rules regarding movable aerodynamic devices. But the FIA realised that towards the end of the season they had to do something about it. Because of the way other teams had engineered their own F Duct systems, called that because the inlet for it on the McLaren was on the F in Vodafone, some of the teams had their drivers taking one of their hands off the wheels to be able to cover the hole in the cockpit, and this was seen as a safety issue. Although it's possible that a couple of the teams might have engineered it that way deliberately to get it banned. At the end of the 2010 season, the FIA had banned the F Duct and replaced it with their own thing called DRS, the drag reduction system, a hydraulically activated flap on the rear of the car that opens up at specific points of the track, with a button being pressed on the steering wheel by the driver, so that the teams could have better chances at overtaking each other. The introduction of the device is as controversial now as it was back then. Some said it was video game-like, some said it was a gimmick, and some said that pressing a button to get a slam dunk overtake isn't racing. And there's also the part about how it should be the quality of the overtake rather than the quantity. Sometimes no overtaking is a good watch. Fernando versus Schumacher at Imola in 2005, Bottas versus Vettel at Sochi in 2017, or even last weekend at Silverstone. It's giving me flashbacks to an official R-Factor 2 esports race back in 2021, I think it was. Indianapolis is where I was racing. I went off at turn 1 and had to come back through the field and finished 8th. Every overtake was done on the DRS and it was so overpowered it was a joke. Yeah, I know, it's a video game, but that day the DRS was like how it was for Lando on the Hangar Straight. So with a spec part being brought in for the 2011 season, the team started looking at it and trying to get the most out of it. Legally, of course. Going into 2012, the teams were already in full aero development mode. The exhaust-blown diffusers that Red Bull had been so good with were now banned, and the teams were looking to gain back some of the rear downforce. The cars of this era were, in design terms more than aesthetic terms, probably the best Formula 1 cars ever created. The amount of different winners, the ability to follow, there was a nice balance there between 2010 and 2013, even if Red Bull did run away with 2011. Okay, there was also 2013, but that was something to do with the reversion to a previous tyre spec or something like that Red Bull just worked better with, but I can't remember. The goal was to claw back rear downforce. The banning of exhaust-blown diffusers had meant that more of the downforce was over the front end, and that made the rear end twitchy. So teams would then have to add more rear wing to keep it planted at the expense of drag. So if they can get more downforce from the underside of the car, they can turn the wing flaps down and get more straight line speed. But Mercedes, knowing that the ban on blown diffusers was coming, had been looking at a different way of extracting top speed. Mercedes had been looking at a way of extracting the most from DRS in late 2011. At the Japanese Grand Prix though, they were found out. Not by another one of the teams, not by the FIA, but by somebody in the media. The same way McLaren's third brake pedal was revealed to the world. What happened was, technical drawing wizard Giorgio Piola had been standing outside the Mercedes garage and had noticed that the Mercedes team members were never touching or lifting the front end of the car up. He took this as, if they're not lifting the front up, there's something there they don't want us to see. so he hung around Schumacher and Rosberg's garages in the hope that somebody there would slip up and show a little bit of what was going on. He then spotted a mechanic shoving his hand underneath the front wing, in a manner that to Piola meant clearing a blockage. He went off and drew a diagram of what he thought Mercedes was doing. The following weekend at the Korean Grand Prix, Schumacher crashed his car and it was put on a low loader to be taken back to the pit lane. When it got back, Piola saw exactly what was going on. He managed to grab some pictures of the front wing, went back to his office or hotel room or wherever and started doing some more drawings of what he actually had to reference this time instead of just making an educated guess. When these were printed in Autosport and on motorsport.com and basically went everywhere around the internet, Ross Brawn called him up to say, "Well done. You got us. Nobody else saw what we were doing." So as they went into 2012, Mercedes was being watched by the other teams before they even flew out to Australia. The other teams had noticed that the Mercedes cars had a more radical design on the rear wing, and it was being debated as to whether or not this was in the rules. The teams jumped on it immediately, asking the FIA to look into it, but the FIA said, "Sorry lads, it's legal." The F Duct system used by McLaren in 2010 had been banned, but that was that specific system that was operated by the driver's hands, elbows, knees or whatever. F Ducts themselves weren't banned, so Mercedes was in the clear. The teams had actually asked the FIA if they could do something F Ducty with the suspension, but Charlie Whiting shut it down immediately because he was saying that the teams were going to be using the suspension primarily for aerodynamics, which wasn't allowed. The suspension had to be suspension. If there was any aerodynamic advantage, it had to be coincidental rather than by design. But Mercedes wasn't just playing around with the rear of the car, they were messing around with the front of it too. Mercedes had an intake installed in the nose cone of the car that helped with driver cooling, but what they'd also done is that they'd installed some pipework in there to help with what they considered to be an aerodynamic advantage. Mercedes had installed F Duct style piping into the nose cone that branched off into the front wing itself. In doing so, it was all rigged up in such a way that when the DRS flap was opened, the high pressure went into the front wing assembly, stalled the front wing, and reduced drag on the front as well as the back, so they got even more straight line speed than they were already getting from just the rear. When the flap closed, the car worked as normal. At least that's how it worked in 2011, because for 2012 the FIA said that intake was going to be for driver cooling and driver cooling only. Now this is the bit that's going to break your brains. You might think then that even with this change in the rules, that what happens is that the air comes in through the intake in the nose, down, through the piping, into the front wing, and does all the magic stuff with the aerostall. But no, the air was coming in from those F duct holes on the rear wing. It's called a fluidic switch. It's not actually a switch, it's just black magic with pressure. Those F duct holes at the back of the car weren't for further stalling the rear wing, but what would happen is that air would rush into those holes and use piping inside the car to come back through into the front end of the car, into the nose cone, and use an F duct system basically in reverse to stall the front wing as the DRS was open for the drag to be removed from the front as well as the rear of the car. As far as I understand it, when the DRS system was shut, those F duct holes were covered up and air couldn't get in there. I mean, some air would have got in there, but it's not going to work anywhere near like it should. When the flap was opened, those holes were revealed and all the air possible could go in there. It's all very, very clever, and it also means that there's no actual mechanical system involved with the front end of this so-called double DRS system. I hope that my crappy drawings that I've shown you in this video have helped, but Giorgio Piola's drawings are on the internet if you do want them in a little bit more detail. I just can't use them in the video, unfortunately. Despite the FIA saying before the Australian Grand Prix the system was legal, Red Bull and Lotus protested it again after qualifying and said that the system was in violation of Articles 3.15 and 3.18 of the technical regulations, saying that the system was not part of the FIA's already approved and regulated DRS system. On the Thursday of the Malaysian Grand Prix weekend, the FIA had unanimously rejected the appeals from Red Bull and Lotus and allowed Mercedes to continue using this W duct as it had become known. Just prior to the Chinese Grand Prix, Lotus protested again, citing the phrase, "Any device that influences the car's aerodynamics must remain immobile in relation to the sprung part of the car," which was the reason the FIA had given when Lotus, then Renault, had the mass dampers banned. Article 13.8.3, which is the bit of the FIA rulebook that governs the whole DRS system, says that DRS is there to help facilitate overtaking, and Mercedes' double DRS system, or W duct, whatever you want to call it, was in line with that objective. Mercedes had also been to the FIA, shown them the system and said, is this legal? Can we use it? And the FIA had gone, yeah, it is, because there's no movable parts on it, so yeah, it's legal. I'm sure the conversation was quite similar to how it went in regards to DAS a few years down the line. Lotus said they wouldn't contest the ruling, although the other teams must have been looking on with some sort of gritted teeth at the Chinese Grand Prix when Rosberg was on pole by over half a second from Hamilton and Schumacher, who were in second and third, with Kobayashi in fourth. It actually started as a Mercedes 1-2 because Hamilton would have to take a gearbox penalty, but Vettel was down in 11th. Rosberg's top speed was only 314 km an hour or 195 miles an hour down that super long back straight they have at Shanghai, but all the time was made up in the acceleration phase because in 2012 DRS use was unlimited and Rosberg was the fastest on the start-finish speed trap. He'd win the race ahead of the two McLarens. But despite having this nifty little system, Mercedes were a little bit stuck with it. The car was heavily reliant on this system, which meant that any upgrades to the car had to be designed around it, and any teams that wanted to copy the system were going to have a bit of a problem with retrofitting it to cars that weren't designed for it. But the other teams around Mercedes, so McLaren, Red Bull, Lotus and Ferrari, had an advantage over Mercedes, and that was the flexing wings. Hard to think that flexible wings had been banned back in 1969, but even back then the engineers were finding ways around them. The Lotus 72D had a wing that was fitted to an incredibly hard rubber bushing that meant when an FIA steward was trying to push down on the wing flap, he wouldn't be able to move it because he wasn't strong enough, so it was legal. But at 180 miles an hour with all that air rushing over it and the downforce loads kicking in, the flap would flatten out and the car would have a very primitive DRS system on the front wing, and it would reduce drag. Perfect for places like the Nürburgring. But by the time 2011 rolled round, things were getting tricky with regards to front wings, and Red Bull, as expected, were the kings of tricking out their front wings. That rhymes. At the start of the 2011 season, people had noticed that at some tracks the Red Bull wings were moving so much that end plates could be striking the tarmac and kicking off sparks, with some estimating there to be about 24mm of flex on them. The FIA had changed the deflection test for 2012, saying that 20mm of flex was the maximum at 100 kilos of load, up from 10mm and 50 kilos, so the Red Bull was outside of the flex limit but still able to get through every race without being disqualified. Whatever Red Bull was doing, its flexing wings were able to run lower to the ground and produce more front wing downforce. With Red Bull starting to add more rake to the car, it would look low anyway, but either way, Red Bull had managed to get a track legal car even with it looking a bit iffy, which led McLaren and Ferrari to try it too. Mercedes, meanwhile, hadn't been able to figure out a way of doing it, so the double DRS, reverse F Duct, W Duct, whatever you want to call it, was the best solution to their problem. But the real problem was, if they were to upgrade their front wing design, every revision to the front wing would have to either incorporate the piping for the double DRS system, or somehow still work properly with the rest of the car, because the car was designed with double DRS in mind. So what it meant was their upgrade path for the front and rear wing was incredibly narrow compared to the other four teams that were around them. So it meant that the system was only of a benefit for a short period. China was the only race that double DRS really came into its own, and if not for a pit stop blunder at that same Grand Prix for Schumacher, maybe Mercedes could have had a 1-2. Mercedes would score just 2 more podiums that year, one for Rosberg at Monaco and Schumacher getting his final podium at the European Grand Prix, although Schumacher did technically get pole at Monaco but lost it because of a collision he had at the Spanish Grand Prix that netted him a grid penalty. But that's not to say that the whole thing was a failure, because Adrian Newey and Red Bull did have a look at their own system, but without most of the drawbacks of what Mercedes had. Red Bull designed a rear wing that was of a similar construction to the Mercedes one, but instead of funneling the air through the car to the front wing, which their car wasn't designed for and would have been a ball ache to work around, they put less piping in and kept the whole thing confined to the rear wing assembly. When the DRS system was opened, the fluidic switch activated. It's not an actual switch, it's just black magic to me, and the air went through the F Duct type piping and down to the beam wing, which then stalled, and they used that to reduce drag on 2 levels instead. Red Bull debuted this at Suzuka, which meant that the system would only have a short lifespan, given that the FIA had already seen fit early in the season to say, okay, you can use this for the rest of the year, but then we're banning it. But it wasn't the only thing that kicked up a fuss that season. Red Bull were alleged to have won the Monaco Grand Prix with an illegal car. It was found that they were doing some sort of trickery with the engine maps to generate grip as some sort of traction control, modifying the torque versus the throttle trace or something along those lines. This caused the FIA to tell the teams they could only use engine maps they used in the first 4 rounds of the season. This became known as the reference map, and any changes needed the approval of the FIA. On top of this, Lotus was trying a legal version of active suspension, using hydraulics located within the brake calipers and the suspension push rods that help stabilise the ride height on the car and keep it at the optimal level for the whole Grand Prix. The FIA had deemed this legal, until Ferrari and Williams asked the FIA to look at their designs for a similar system. While the FIA had deemed Lotus's system fit for use, a week after Williams and Ferrari submitted their plans, the FIA banned the device and referred the teams to Article 3.15. This is that same article I referred to earlier when they asked Charlie Whiting about doing F Duct stuff with the suspension. The suspension has to be suspension rather than being designed to be an aerodynamic device. As soon as it's primarily an aerodynamic device, it becomes illegal. But this is all part of the cool thing about this period of racing. Sure, the cars might not have been the most aesthetically pleasing of the last 20 years or so, but there was so much going on with regards to the teams trying to get a competitive edge. We saw diffuser trickery, a prototype DRS that was so effective the FIA introduced their own version, ride height trickery, and the focus of today's video, the double DRS system. With today's modern cost caps and everything being slammed shut almost immediately, it will probably be a while before we see something that the teams will scramble to copy. But the period from 2009 to 2013 was great for all of this grey area exploitation that, when you look deeper into it, was pretty cool. It's just that Mercedes wasn't able to improve on it because of how limited they would be in car design. Because of the other teams not designing a similar system, I mean, even if they wanted to, it would have been tricky to get all that stuff in the car. The other teams had a much bigger range of upgrades they could apply, and in the end, compared to those other teams, Mercedes stood still after that win at China. But I guess that's one thing you can say about double DRS. It won a Grand Prix. A lot of these big brain moments never do. So then, that concludes today's video on the Mercedes double DRS system from 2012 that, while innovative, held them back a little bit. If this has been an interesting blast from the past, then do give the video a like so I know a good job was done, and for more like this, get subscribed and also get that bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the rad lads over at Patreon who support the channel at a more personal level, and if you want to help keep things running around here, a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, and other bits and pieces that you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks down there for a one-off donation, and also memberships for those that want a Patreon alternative. So until next time, I've been Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.